Well, brothers and sisters and boys and girls, Jacob is challenged once again in this text. He's caught up in this struggle with Laban. And as we think of the story of Jacob, it really is all about struggle, isn't it? We've seen struggle throughout. We know the first struggle was in the womb already between Esau and Jacob. And then there was the struggle for the birthright and the blessing. And then there was the struggle that Jacob had with Laban to get the wife that he wanted, Rachel. Instead, he got Leah at first, right? And then last time, it's been a little bit, but last time we saw the struggle between the two wives as they are competing with one another for Jacob's love and for esteem in the household and having children and all of that. And now we see the struggle that Jacob has to leave. So that's why I've titled this sermon, Let Me Go. Can we relate to Jacob and all of this struggle? Well, sure we can. Yeah, we definitely can. We also struggle. We have a threefold struggle, you could say, with our threefold enemy, the devil, the world, and the flesh. The devil, we're told in the New Testament, right? This is Peter saying this after Jesus has already rose from the dead. He says, the devil is like a roaring lion seeking to devour. So that is still a reality for us. We struggle against the devil, defeated though he is. The world has good in it for sure, and we're thankful for that. But as we look at the world opposed to God in its worldliness, we struggle against the world. There's a spiritual battle going on between good and evil. And then we struggle against our own selves. That's what we mean by that word flesh, right? We struggle against our own selves, our sinful nature. The remnants of that are still there. They still cling to us. So we struggle. What are we to do in light of these struggles? How do we gain victory over our enemies? Well, those questions are answered in Genesis 30 and 31 here in this conflict between Jacob and Laban. So let's get into it. Jacob, as we look at him, as we find him in chapter 30, he has a good thing going in some ways. If your Bibles are open, and I certainly encourage you to have them open, verse 27 of chapter 30 and following, Laban points out that the Lord has blessed him because of Jacob. And Jacob says his livestock has fared well, and all that he has increased abundantly, and the Lord has blessed him. There's a lot of prosperity. And then that came with the promise of God's presence, as I referred back to Bethel. But whose prosperity is it? Who's the one prospering? It's Laban. It's not Jacob. Laban is prospering thanks to the presence of Jacob. Right? The presence of God is with Jacob. There's this spin-off benefit to Laban being in Jacob's presence. And that's great for Laban maybe, but Jacob is not really prospering. Jacob's been working in servitude. We could even say slavery in a certain understanding of that word. You see it 2 times in verse 26 that he says, I have served you, the service I have given you. That's what he views this as. He's been working hard at building not his own wealth, but building Laban's wealth. And he's a good worker. We get that sense from the text. He's an honest worker. Chapter 31, he has served, he says to Rachel and Leah, I served your father with all my strength. Hard worker. We heard a bigger description later on in that chapter where he talks about all the things that he's done. The goats have not miscarried. He hasn't eaten any of the rams. He has to face wild beasts, and he bore the loss of all that was eaten by wild beasts. He bore that himself. It's admirable, right? Heat consumed him. He had to deal with the cold at night. He had lacked sleep. He goes through this whole description of all the things that he's done in the 20 years he's worked for Laban. He's a hard worker, an honest worker. But Laban is very different. Chapter 31, verse 7, Laban is a cheater. Your father has cheated me and changed my wages 10 times. That's the nature of what he does. He's changed my wages again, chapter 40 or verse 41, 10 times. It's a lot of times. And yet despite all of this cheating, all of this work that Laban has done against Jacob, to harm Jacob, we could say, Jacob has been protected. God has protected Jacob. Verse 5, chapter 31. God, the God of my father, has been with me. And then verse 7, God did not permit Laban to harm me. And he says again in verse 42, that God has been on my side. So God has protected Jacob. And now Jacob recalls the rest of the promise, which is to return. If you remember back to Bethel in that dream, God had said to Jacob, I will bring you back to this land. I will bring you back to Canaan. And now the time for that has come. And so Jacob goes to Laban and he says, hey, Laban, I want to go. It's time to go. Let me go. I'm going to go back home to, along with my wives and children, all my household, I'm going to go back. But first, there's something that he needs to do. Chapter 30, verse 30. But now, when shall I provide for my own household also? So he needs to provide for himself. He needs to have his own wealth. Right? We saw by the end he has that, but at the beginning that wasn't a sure thing. So how's he going to get that? And now we know who Laban is. We know enough about him to know he's a cheater. We just covered that. He's stingy. Right? He's this crafty guy that's got it out for Jacob to a certain degree at least. And yet Jacob is also crafty. And so Jacob concocts this plan to separate the stronger animals from the weaker animals. And he has this process of selective breeding, and he's got these branches up, and apparently that makes the difference with the spots and the stripes and so on, right? At least that's how we read the story. And over 6 years, verse 41 tells us this takes 6 years. Over the course of 6 years, we read at the end of chapter 30 that thus the man increased greatly, that is, Jacob increased greatly, and had large flocks, female servants and male servants, and camels and donkeys. So Jacob is prosperous. Now the important question, or one of the important questions, who prospered him? Who's prospering Jacob here? Himself? It appears that way, right? It appears that the credit should go to Jacob. Again, he's the one who's doing this process of selective breeding, and he has this neat idea with the sticks and the troughs and all of these things. And brothers and sisters, we also think this way about our own lives. We focus on our own actions, and we give ourselves, or maybe we give other people, credit for their ingenuity and for their work and for their craftiness, maybe even. But we need to realize that God is the one who's prospering Jacob. There's no magic to these stripes and these spots and these branches. There's not science behind that. What's happening is that God is working in a special way, in a supernatural, miraculous way. And he's working behind the scenes, to be sure, but we could then say the hidden hand of God is present. God is the one at work. He's preparing Jacob for the journey that is before him by giving him this wealth. And so when it comes to our lives, we don't always get this revealed to us very clearly, very explicitly, that God's hidden hand is at work. Right? We have to recognize that with the eyes of faith, that is in fact the case. But here, it's made obvious. Here, it's explicit. Because again, chapter 30 is the account of what it looked like happened, that Jacob did this and all of this kind of just happened. But chapter 31, verses 10 through 13 especially, gives the theological perspective on what really happened. And Jacob tells us, he says that in the breeding season, God gave him a dream. And in that dream, he encouraged him by reminding him of Bethel and all the promises that he had made. And then he called Jacob to go back to his homeland. And then he inspired him to plunder Laban of his flocks. You see that in verse 12 as God tells Jacob to lift up his eyes. And he plants the seed of the idea that will cause Jacob to increase in his flocks. And so Jacob says then, as he's talking to his wives, that's who he's talking to in this early section of chapter 31, verse 9, he says, "Thus God has taken away the livestock of your father and given them to me." He realizes, Jacob does, God is the one who has ultimately done this. Now, how does Laban respond to Jacob? With resentment. Twice we read, early in chapter 31, he did not regard him with favor as he did before. So there's this confrontation that's coming. It's building up to that. And so because of that, Rachel and Leah have to make a choice. Because there's this clear contrast between Laban and God. Actually, it's very interesting if you flip back to chapter 29, verse 1. It's a little tidbit perhaps, but Jacob went on his journey, we read, and came to the land of the people of the east. Now, why would they be called the people of the east? Laban and his people are in the north. Right? As he travels, if you look at a map, it's a more northerly direction. It wouldn't be a common thing to call them people of the east. I wonder why chapter 29 does that. Well, how about this? Ever since Genesis 3, east has been associated with away from the presence of the Lord. Right? Adam and Eve left the garden and they went east of Eden. That's where they were sent, away from the presence of God. And so here's the contrast that we have in our text. Here's the contrast before Rachel and Leah. Are they going to dwell in the presence of Laban, in this idolatrous household of Laban? Or are they going to dwell in the presence of God, in the promised land? Two distinct choices. What is their identity? Different way of asking the same question. Are they a daughter of Laban? Or are they a wife of Jacob? And what's their answer? Well, they say Laban has not been a good father to us. Laban has sold us and devoured our money. We have no inheritance with Laban. Jacob, we will throw our lot in with you and your God. They're very decisive on that. And we're going to come back to this response that they give in a little bit. In the meantime, we have this confrontation building. Jacob saying, let me go. Laban saying, no. And then Jacob tricks Laban, we're told, and he flees without him knowing about it. Gets a head start. But Laban resists Jacob's attempt to flee. He's not going to just let him go. And so he pursues him. And he overtakes him. And then we come to the moment of confrontation. And how does Jacob handle it? How does Jacob handle this confrontation with Laban? Well, it's a bit of a struggle, to be honest. He struggles to handle it well. He's filled with fear, we're told in verse 31. I was afraid. Is that necessary? Should he have been afraid? Well, through it all, God has been with Jacob. You know, we can see that throughout this chapter. Verse 12, at the end of it, I have seen all that Laban is doing to you, says God. He's not unaware. He's seen it. And I am the God of Bethel, remember, where I made you those promises. Go out from this land and return to the land of your kindred. And then he says, as he says that, verse 3, back to verse 3, I will be with you. As you return to the land of your fathers and to your kindred, I will be with you. So God has promised him all of these things repeatedly. And now, right as Jacob and Laban are in this confrontation, what happens? God shows up to Laban. Verse 29, God spoke to me last night, Laban says, saying, be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. Verse 24 gives the account of that. So there's this reaffirmation of the promises to Jacob through Laban. Jacob is seeing here, yeah, God is protecting me. The God who has seen me, the God who has been with me, he continues to be with me. And so that leads Jacob to confess in the middle of the confrontation very boldly to Laban. Verse 42. If the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had not been on my side, surely now you would have sent me away empty-handed. God saw my affliction and the labor of my hands and rebuked you last night. And see, that's a confession of faith, brothers and sisters. That shows progress in Jacob. If you think back to that sermon about Bethel, we looked at how he was transformed by the presence of God. But we said that transformation is a work in progress. That Jacob would still have issues he'd have to deal with personally. He'd still show weak faith. He's still understanding who this God is. Well, this is progress. Transformation is happening. Because what we've said about him previously in the last number of sermons is that Jacob lacks in spirituality. He lacks spiritual sensitivity. Jacob lacks in leadership within his home. Well, what are we seeing now? Jacob is emerging as a man of public faith. And he is taking leadership of his household. And when God commands him to return, he acts right away. And he bears witness to his wives of all that God had promised, his presence, his protection, his provision. And then he bears further witness, public witness, to Laban and all of Laban's family. So there's transformation in this man, Jacob. And what's the result of all of this? What's the result of this confrontation and the way Jacob stands up to Laban? Well, it's victory. Victory for God and victory for Jacob. And we have some questions. We have some questions about the idols that Rachel stole and what that means for this family, Jacob and his family. And we're going to get to that in a later part of the story, the Jacob story. But this covenant is made. That's how the chapter ends, right? This covenant is made, which signifies a relationship between Jacob and Laban. Not an intimate relationship, but a relationship of understanding. They've come to an understanding. And they're not going to harm each other. Jacob's going to do right by Laban as far as his daughters go. And so they depart in peace. Laban kisses and blesses his grandchildren and his daughters, and he goes home with the remainder of his household, and Jacob goes on his way with his family back to Canaan. Now, what's the lesson in this for us? If we're looking for a lesson, what do we see here? Is this a story of comeuppance? You know, Laban's done this cheating, he's been stingy, he's done wrong to Jacob, and now he's received his reward? Is that the lesson? Or is it that those who walk with God will get rich and not suffer any harm? Is that the lesson? Well, how about for Israel? Right, they're the people who first hear this. This is given, first of all, to the nation of Israel. How about for them? See, as we look at Israel, Jacob's descendants, right, that's who Israel is, they're going to find themselves away from the promised land in Egypt in a time of servitude, right? It's called a house of bondage or a house of slavery, Exodus 20. And yet, even as they're there in Egypt, God is still present with them. And there are those seeking to do them harm, but despite that, they are protected. And they even prosper. Right? They increase in number, and they're healthy and strong. They become a numerous people. And then there's also this other part of God's promise that is always before them, this promise of return. Right? That's the great hope of Israel. It's what leads Joseph, when he's dying, to give instructions about his bones to the people, saying, bring them into the land, because the land that God swore on oath to our fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, references Jacob, that land, we're going to get that. You are going to get that. So take my bones with you. And then, of course, in time, God raises up a leader, Moses. And what does Moses say along with Aaron on behalf of God? Let my people go. Let us go. Now, what's Pharaoh's response to that? Well, like Laban, he has resentment and resistance. You're not going to take my workforce. You're not going to injure my pride. And so there's this resistance, which is leading to confrontation. It starts with the plagues, God and Pharaoh seeking to outdo each other, we could say. We know how that goes. A series of conflicts leading up to this great confrontation. And so like Leah and like Rachel, the Israelites have a decision to make. Because there's this clear contrast between God and Pharaoh. So are they going to dwell in the presence of Pharaoh in the idolatrous land of Egypt? Or are they going to dwell in the presence of God and journey to the promised land? Another way of asking the question is, what is their identity? Slave in Egypt or pilgrim in the desert? And for all who put the blood of the lamb on their door frames, the answer was clear. We are part of God's people. We are Israelites. Of course, Pharaoh continues to resist. He's not just going to let the Israelites go, and so he pursues Israel. And he overtakes Israel. And how did Israel handle it when Pharaoh did this along with his army? Well, it was a bit of a struggle for them. They didn't handle it that well. They were filled with fear, we're told. They complain to Moses and they say, look, there's the army, here's the sea, we have nowhere to go. And they wanted to give up. They're on the verge of giving up because of their fear. Is that necessary? Well, you know, God had always been with them. His presence was with them. He had protected them. He had even prospered them. And so also now he was going to do it. And so the sea, which looked like an obstacle, became an opportunity as it opened up. And they walked through the midst of the sea on dry ground. And had victory. That's the result for them, victory. As Pharaoh and his army are destroyed, and the Egyptians are plundered because they had all given their wealth to Israel, saying, please get out of here, take whatever you want, just go. Right? That's where all that gold comes from. And so Moses sings triumphantly a song of victory, leading the people in praising God for his presence and his protection and prosperity. And then the Israelites come into the desert, and a couple things happen, but the covenant is renewed. Once again, confirmation that the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob is the God of this people, Israel, this nation. And there's still questions. There's questions about their continued struggle with idols, questions about their continued struggle with fear. They still have yet to experience the reality of exile. And even after exile and they return to the land in the time of the New Testament, they have to deal with occupation, right, the Romans. And regardless of the time, they still have to deal with the reality of sin. So their story is incomplete. Well, how is the story completed? In Jesus. What does Jesus say to Satan? Fundamentally speaking, he says this. He says, let my people go. Hebrews 2 tells us, verse 14 and 15, that the devil is the one who has the power of death. He has that power, and that's only true because we have sinned against God, and the wages of sin, Romans 6 says, is death. So the devil has the power of death because of our sin. As sinful people, Hebrews 2 says, we, through fear of death, were subject to lifelong slavery. And so this is what we mean when in Lord's Day 1 we confess the need to be delivered from the tyranny of the devil, or to be set free from the power of the devil. And so Jesus to Satan says, let my people go. What's Satan's response? Well, he's a lot like Laban and Pharaoh. Resistance. He doesn't want to let us go. And so you see this early on in Jesus' life, in Herod's attempt to murder Jesus, right? All the boys of a certain age. You see it directly in that attack that Satan makes in the desert after Jesus' baptism as his ministry begins. You see it through the constant demonic opposition that Jesus faces in his ministry. It happens more subtly through those who oppose Jesus' teaching, but more overtly through those who are demon-possessed, and how Jesus really has to deal with the demons that way very directly. And all of this, all that Jesus is doing, all this opposition, this conflict, it's all leading to a great confrontation at the cross. And now at the cross, the time has come. The hour is at hand. And we look at the cross and we can wonder about it in one way, but we know that God, who appeared to be hidden as Jesus was suffering and as he died, was actually actively working behind the scenes in the greatest way. Because there at the cross, the promised one, Jesus, set about his work of fulfilling all that he was promised, all that God had promised. Protection, prosperity, and a return to the promised land. So let my people go, are Jesus' words, as good as any. What was the result of this confrontation as Jesus stood up to Satan? As Jesus rose from death to life, right, the Father's amen to the Son's, it is finished. What could Satan do? Well, there's no more resistance. He can't put forward any more resistance. So, beloved, realize this, that this continues to be the case today. Christ is victorious. And so like Rachel, and like Leah, and like Israel, there's only one question that ultimately matters today. Who do we identify with? Are we enslaved to the tyrant, Satan? Or are we followers of the good Lord, Jesus Christ? Are we living in sin, or is our life in him? The story isn't quite finished for us either, is it? There's still struggles. But we have peace. And we have peace, importantly, now. And we have God's presence, and we have God's protection, and we have that now. And so, often we have this negative outlook on the world, and there's good reason for that. We're called to avoid corruption, and like we said at the beginning, there is this spiritual battle going on. But because we have God's peace and protection and prosperity now, we can have a positive role in the world too, even as we're pilgrimaging through the world. Because remember, even unbelievers can be blessed in the presence of God, in our presence as we are blessed by God. These are temporal blessings, still true blessings nonetheless. But regardless of the challenges we face, because temporal blessings aren't a guarantee, regardless of the challenges we face, we can be assured of God's eternal blessing, His eternal protection, and His eternal prosperity as we live eternally in His glorious presence. So, brothers and sisters, as we close, since God has promised us such great things, and since Jesus has done for us such great things, and since the Spirit is the guarantee of such great things, then I exhort you to live out of confidence, not fear. Give Him all the credit, that is the glory, and then act boldly, knowing that He is on your side. Identify with Him, and then rejoice that we too are conquerors through Him who loved us. Amen. And in line